Many people in Shandong are very consciously proud of their Confucian heritage. Xunzi himself is from what was then the state of Lu, which is part of Shandong province. So the Confucianism is really part of the self-identification of many people in Shandong. The Nishan Forum is a large-scale gathering of people or scholars who have this interest in Confucianism, and it's international. The Confucianism really emphasizes, it has stereotypes, it's kind of boring and conservative, but that's complete misunderstanding. The Confucians very much take joy in this life and in social relations, and that's exercised through singing. In Chinese, there's this idea of it's through beautiful music and participating rituals that we could generate a sense of harmony and bonding among people. So this ideal of political meritocracy in Chinese is 贤能政治, and that's been institutionalized through different means throughout Chinese history, and it's still there now to a great extent. It informs the way that public officials are selected and promoted, and they're supposed to have ability, meaning proven experience serving in a lower level government before you can be promoted at a higher level. In East Asia, not just China, but Japan, Korea, Vietnam, all are modernizing quite quickly in a relatively peaceful and harmonious way. It seems that some interpretations of Confucianism, for example, this worldly outlook, the desire for constant self-improvement and to work hard, a concern for future generations, all these values and strong value based on education, all these values actually contribute to modernization if the other conditions are in place.
Welcome to Inside the China Room, your premier destination for insights into China's current events. I'm your host, Jiang Jiang. On July the 9th and 10th, the 11th Nishan Forum of World Civilizations will be held in Qufu, located in East China's Shandong province. Qufu is renowned as the birthplace of Confucius and the historical heartland of Confucian culture. This year's forum explores the relationship among diverse civilizations and global modernization. Why has China increasingly emphasized Confucianism in recent cultural dialogues? How does Confucian thought influence contemporary Chinese politics? And what unique insights can understanding Shandong provide about China as a whole? To discuss these questions, I'm delighted to be joined by Daniel Bell, Chair of Political Theory with the Faculty of Law at the University of Hong Kong, and the Vice President of the International Confucian Association. Daniel's research area includes comparative political theory, Confucianism, and legalism, and he'll also be speaking at this year's Nishan Forum. From 2017 to 2022, Daniel served as Dean of the School of Political Science and Public Administration at Shandong University, the first foreigner in the Chinese mainland's history to hold such a position. His book, The Dean of Shandong, published in 2023, chronicles his experiences as what he calls a minor bureaucrat. Daniel has also taught at Beijing's Tsinghua University for 13 years. In 2018, Daniel was awarded a Huilin Prize and honored as a cultural leader by the World Economic Forum. In 2021, he was selected as a People's Friendship Envoy of Shandong Province. Hi, Professor Bell. Welcome to Inside the China Room.
Hello, thanks for the overly kind introduction.
Thank you. I'm very happy to have you on my show. You are about to attending this year's Nishan Forum on World Civilizations in Shandong, and you previously have taught in Shandong for 5 years. So could you first tell our listeners, especially those who haven't read your book, The Dean of Shandong, what you mainly did during those 5 years in Shandong?
Well, I was appointed as dean. It was a great honor. It's a large faculty with about 800 students and about 80 professors as well. And I had two kind of tasks. One is to help the faculty internationalize, to give more opportunity for our students to go abroad and to hire more foreign professors and so on. But equally, perhaps even more important, was to help promote Confucian values. And I was hired by the party secretary, whose surname was Kong, which he's a 76th generation descendant of Confucius, of Xunzi. And he's very proud of the Confucian heritage. And he thought that I might be able to help to promote Confucianism in the faculty. Now, you have to remember that Confucianism, is very obviously the mainstream political culture in Chinese history, but it's not too many people self-identify as Confucians in China. It's more like people say, like the water we swim in, that we have certain Confucian values like xiao, like filiality, and we respect he. We can translate that as differentiated harmony. We have all those Confucian values without calling ourselves Confucian. But I think Shandong maybe is the exception, where many people in Shandong are very consciously proud of their Confucian heritage. One important reason is that Confucius, in Chinese Kongzi himself, is from what was then the state of Lu, which is part of Shandong province. So the Confucianism is really part of the self-identification of many people in Shandong. So, for example, the license plate of Shandong province, the character is Lu, which so the long extinct state of Lu. Why did they choose that? Again, because it was the state of Confucius. If you take Shandong Airlines, above every seat, there's a quote from the Analects of Confucius.
Really?
There are many statues of Confucianism all around Shandong province. In villages, there's conscious effort to promote Confucian values such as xiao, which says filiality, so that to increase respect for elderly parents and also reverence for ancestors. So in Shandong province, it's a province of 100 million people, and the Confucian heritage is still very much conscious part of the province.
You mentioned that actually Shandong is the birthplace of the Confucian culture. One thing that I would like to brought up to the table is that, in Shandong, because people who graduated from university, they are supposed to be more willing to join like the government, to do like civil servants. Did you find that type of trend? And I believe you also mentioned some other things. Can you tell us more about your discovering in Shandong?
I think that's right. So Confucianism is a very diverse tradition, and Confucius Kongzi himself is one, obviously the most famous and influential interpreter of that tradition, but other famous Confucians are from Shandong as well, including Mencius, Mengzi, Xunzi spent a lot of time there. And they roamed from state to state trying to persuade, this was before China was unified under self-proclaimed Qinshi Huangdi. They roamed from state to state trying to persuade rulers to rule in a moral way, more in accordance with the Confucian ethics. And they were not very successful. But they left this legacy that, the good life involves nourishing, humane, and harmonious ties with the family, which we then extend outside the family. And nearly everybody can do that. But the best life for a minority of people who have, let's say, above average ability and virtue, should strive to serve the public. Because if you have political power, that's the best way of doing good in society. So they left this legacy that the best life involves a life of public service, as opposed to, for example, some religions saying the best life is maybe an otherworldly life, or some, Taoists might say, well, you should extricate yourself from social relations and write poetry on a mountain. But for Confucians, it's really, if you have the opportunity to do so, if there's a little bit of way in which you can make a difference, then you should strive to join the public service. So that has a huge legacy in Shandong province, and it's quite measurable, that there's a greater proportion. Shandong is a big province, 100 million people, but so many people throughout Chinese history from Shandong have sought to serve the public in some capacity or other, whether it's writing the imperial examinations, or serving the local community, or serving at the very highest levels of government. And you still see it today at my university, Shandong University, where there was very, very strong competition to participate in examinations for a public service, 公务员考试, and great pride for those who succeeded. So when some of my students succeeded, we'd be so happy. We would throw parties for them. That sort of thing. Frankly, now I'm in Hong Kong. You don't really have that in Hong Kong, that sort of culture. That's one way. Also, the Confucianism really emphasizes, that it has a stereotype that's kind of boring and conservative, but that's complete misunderstanding. The Confucians very much take joy in this life and in social relations, and that's exercised through singing. Because in Chinese, there's this idea of 礼乐, so the rituals and music come together. That's the good life. It's through beautiful music and participating in rituals that we could generate a sense of harmony and bonding among people. And partly that means also participating in banquets, which are very detailed and ritualized. It's very interesting too. The closer you get to like ground zero of the Confucian tradition, i.e. 曲服, the greater the number of toasts that the host has to make. So if you're like right in 曲服, it could be 6, sometimes even 8. But as you move away from 曲服, it goes like, I was in Qingdao, so it was only 3 in Qingdao. But it's highly ritualized. The host makes the toast, and then the co-host. And you're supposed to, each person who hosts a banquet has to take care of a guest. So you have this tradition, Shandong Haoke, that you should treat your guests with great hospitality. And so you have these highly ritualized banquets with also, frankly, with drinking sometimes alcohol, because that's also a way of generating social harmony. Sometimes it's a bit
Most people are
excessive.
famous for drinking, right?
Exactly. So
Yeah.
that could take a bit of that. Sometimes that could take, not so positive ways. But because it's controlled and ritualized, again, I served 5 years as dean. I never really saw horrible excesses. I mean, one stereotype about Shandong province that is very patriarchal. I mean, it's partly true. Confucianism, like other major traditions, has been patriarchal, but it's very much a kind of vulgarized interpretation of Confucianism. And many people today try to reinterpret the Confucian tradition so it's more friendly to gender equality. So when we had banquets at the university, for example, we would never have this kind of explicit discrimination against women. And again, it depends on the person's social status and age. And if she happened to be the person with the most status, like for example, at Shandong University for a while, when I was there, the president was female, then of course she would have the most honored position at the table.
But I'm wondering, is there any like small stories that your interactions with your students in Shandong impress you about the impact of Confucianism on them? Maybe their ego, maybe their purpose to get the exams for the public officials, or their way of talking,
Well, as mentioned, there is this very strong competition to participate in examinations for public service, but it's also in the interaction between students and teachers. There's a great deal of respect for teachers, again, which is part of the Confucian tradition,
Yes.
but it's not meant to be blind respect, right? I mean, if the teacher does something kind of morally bad, then the students have an obligation to remonstrate. So one story, which actually I mentioned in the book as well, is, it was one of the banquets at a restaurant where there was pretty heavy drinking. And I took my bicycle to the restaurant, and perhaps my students observed that I had had a few too many drinks and I wanted to cycle home, but they stopped me from doing so. It's just like you literally almost using force to stop me from getting on my bicycle. So of course, the teachers also have a strong obligation to care for the students, not help them find jobs and publish articles and so on. But also, it's a kind of lifelong relation with students, a form of caring, which I've taught again in Beijing and also in Hong Kong and Singapore. And I find that relation is quite strong, perhaps stronger in Shandong province. Well, I only have one graduate student now in Hong Kong, and he's from Shandong, so we still have that same relation.
Yeah, and you mentioned that there are actually lots of elements under the philosophy of Confucianism, something that not contemporary Chinese government maybe emphasize more than the others. I think you mentioned about it in some previous interviews. For instance, you mentioned about the value of xiao, the filial piety or care of reverence for elderly family members and ancestors. That's kind of related to China's aging population, or the emphasis on the importance of family, maybe get married. Can you tell us more about your observations that which aspects of Confucian culture do current Chinese decision makers emphasize more strongly nowadays?
Well, you mentioned xiao. Well, let's just translate it as filial piety. Um, I, that is strongly emphasized by the government, and it's taught in schools. I mean, actually, my son went to the primary school attached to Tsinghua University, and he was graded according to how xiao he was. And frankly, he didn't do very well. I think he got B minus. I'm not sure why. But anyway, that sort of thing, I'm from Canada, would be, completely odd, right? To use that as a way of grading students in schools. There's actually a law in China which, literally forces adult children to provide material support for their parents. I guess that's partly for economic reasons, but I think partly because the value of xiao is just so uncontroversial in Chinese society that the government can promote these sorts of values without strong opposition. In the Confucian text, I mean, why is that so important? Well, there's a basic assumption that if you have humane and harmonious relations within the family, then probably the society as a whole is more likely to be more humane and harmonious. So let's start by having humane and harmonious families. That's the way of more likely that you'll have humane and harmonious society at large. Again, though this has been very vulgarized, that you should blindly obey your parents, or you should blindly obey rulers, or wives should blindly obey husbands. Those are really vulgar and misguided interpretations of the Confucian tradition, although in practice, often those have great social impact. Yeah. That's why we need intellectuals to provide better interpretations. Yeah.
Yeah. I think part of the reason we are doing this podcast is also to let more people understand like what the real Confucian value means. And according to my observation, people tend to talk about Confucianism when they talk about family values, and sometimes it sounds like Chinese people influenced by Confucianism care a lot about their family, comparing with the Western values. But according to my observation, I think you are from Canada. I think Western people also care about their families, but there are still some differences between that. What would you say about the main differences in terms of family values between China and the Western values in terms of this?
If you look at the history of Western philosophy, and I'm simplifying here, but not that much, the family was viewed more as a sphere of necessity, as a means to the good life, but the good life lies outside the family. For example, in the case of Aristotle, it lies in politics and also in philosophical contemplation, or in some traditions, more in religious practices. But for the Confucian tradition, the family it's not just a means to the good life, it's essential to the good life. That's where you learn about morality, about care and love and reverence, and those values you learn from the family, and then you extend them outside the family. So there's been this really radically different emphasis. In the Western traditions, it's only in the past century or so that feminists have begun to pay attention to the family as a sphere of the good life. And there's this tradition in feminism about care ethics. It's in the family that we learn about care, not by reading books about abstract justice, but by practicing care and through particular relations in the family. That's the kind of form of justice. And of course, feminists want equal gender relations between men and women as well. They say you can't have equality outside the family if you don't have equality within the family. So feminists have begun to pay more attention to the family, but it's quite recent in the Western tradition. So that's really a very important difference. But another important difference, which it's in just very concretely in law. I mean, as mentioned, in China, and not just in China, but other countries in East Asia with a Confucian heritage, filiality is compulsory. You literally have an obligation to provide care for elderly parents. That would be highly unusual in Canada, where I'm from, or where I'm in Hong Kong now. Half of the people live in public housing, and you get a tax break if you live with your elderly parents. Again, that sort of thing would be very odd in a kind of Canadian context.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, as mentioned earlier, politically too, the assumption is that if you have stable and harmonious families, then you have stable and harmonious polity at large too. These sorts of values are more central to Confucianism than to. There's also just, again, I'm simplifying, but there's this assumption, and again, I'm from Canada, when you reach 18, then you become fully autonomous. You can maintain your family ties if you want, but it's a matter of choice at the end of the day. But if I want to just start my life that's separate from my family, that's more or less okay. It's my personal choice. But in a kind of society with a Confucian tradition, it's not a matter so much of personal choice whether you want to maintain ties with your family. What shape those ties are, when they're to be manifested, and so on, all that we can argue about. But the idea that you can choose to completely break off ties with family and other social relations once you're 18, that's very odd in a kind of society with a Confucian heritage. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And besides family values, another things I want to talk about is like because we talk about it a little bit before, is the conduct of the public officials. I think for decades, the Chinese officials have the government emphasized about the virtue and their ability of the public officials. So how do you think that the Confucianism shapes the governance style and the conduct of Chinese officials? This year China is now having a campaign of emphasizing the 8-point rules, 8项规定, right, to emphasize the conduct of the officials. It's actually something It's also about the virtual. Part of it is about the virtuals. Could you share with us more of your observations how these Confucianism influence current conducts of officials in China?
Yeah, so this ideal of political meritocracy in Chinese is 贤能政治. This idea that the political system should aim to select and promote public officials with superior ability and virtue. And that's been institutionalized through different means throughout Chinese history, most famously through the examination system in Imperial China, the Keju system. And it's still there now to a great extent. It informs the way that public officials are selected and promoted. And they're supposed to have ability, meaning proven experience serving in a lower level government before you can be promoted at a higher level, but also virtue, meaning that a willingness to serve the public as opposed to misusing public resources for your own or your family interests, i.e., don't be corrupt. And that goes throughout Chinese history. This campaigns against corruption. It's never going to completely go away. And Confucians themselves have a long and rich tradition of discussing or even arguing about how best to minimize corruption. So among the early Confucians, probably my favorite political Confucian is Xunzi, because he had this idea, of course, the public officials should be committed first and foremost to the public interest, but they also need to be rewarded adequately. I mean, if I'm a public official and I have a tiny salary, for example, and my mother gets ill and I need to pay, for her to get proper medical care and buy medicine and so on, and then, well, maybe it's easier to be tended to be corrupt in that context. So therefore, it's important for public officials to be more properly remunerated. So I'm not going to criticize the current way of trying to deal with potential corruption in China, but I do think Xunzi provides very clear warning about don't make it too difficult for public officials to lead a decent life. And if they do well, then they should be properly rewarded.
Actually, I think what you just mentioned also echoes with some articles published by the media. They emphasize that don't overuse like the 8 points to overregulate the behavior of the officials, because sometimes they just have their family dinners or with their friends, like it's totally normal. So I think the authorities is also trying to balance between make sure that they are not corrupt, but on the other hand, they can have the flexibility to enjoy their lives.
I hope so. But frankly, the salaries are still too low for public officials in China. That's my view. But I realize China is not as wealthy as Singapore, so it can't immediately provide Singapore-style salaries. But anyway, I should say, when I was first appointed as dean, this was in the early days. This was 2016, 2017. Like we had to. It was every single meal we had to write down what dishes we ordered, and it became so and who we invited, and of course, you couldn't use alcohol at public expense, and it became so burdensome to organize meals that finally, many of us just decided to just swallow that we're not going to have too many of those meals, even though they're important because they're a great source of joy for one thing, but also it's a way of establishing trust between people. And once you have trust between people, it's much easier to solve problems and to get things done, right? How do you get that trust? It's through such joyful occasions. In China, it's so important part of the culture, right? That if you want to solve problems or make a deal, it involves repeated, banquets and so on. And then that's part of of course, it could take nasty or negative forms if it involves corruption. But we need to think about how to preserve the good side of that tradition as well.
Yeah,
I think alcohol, I'm not so much, I do think alcohol is very important to forge a sense of bonding with people, but we should respect those who don't like to drink, right? So like in Shandong province, if we had toasting with baijiu, with white liquor, but some people didn't like to drink, then you just pour them water and have a symbolic toasting. That's fine. They shouldn't experience any pressure to drink. But those of us who want to drink, we bring our own liquor, then yeah, why not? That's a good thing, so long as it's controlled and ritualized. Yeah.
Yeah, and as long as they are, I mean, if the officials they are follow like the rules that they are required to follow, that will be okay. Yeah, and I want to talk about Xunzi because you mentioned that he's actually one of your favorite Confucianism thoughts thinkers. So in your previous lecture, you detailed a creative dialogue between Confucian and Islamic civilization, citing the Chinese Confucian thinker Xunzi and the 14th century Islamic scholar Ibn Haldun. Could you tell about your encounters in Chufu? Because I saw you mention it in your previous lectures that you met some encounters in Chufu or maybe elsewhere with Muslims who embrace Confucianism or Confucian enthusiasts who follow Islam. What unique characteristics of intercultural exchanges and integrations have you observed in them? And what lessons might this offer in an era marked by global disorder and confrontation?
Okay, so it's two things. So one is I wrote an article with another descendant of Kongzi. His name is Kong Xingfeng, and now he's a dean at Minzu University in Beijing. And he's a very old friend. And together we wrote an article on the spirit of Chufu. And we went to a Muslim district in Chufu, and we spoke to some Muslims, and we were curious about how, if any way, they could reconcile Confucian ethics with Islam, and so we interviewed some, and of course they practiced Islam didn't in the sense that they don't eat pork and they worship the God and so on, but they also have a strong commitment to education and self improvement, and xiao, this value, is also important to them, and we interviewed a young woman, and she was very conscious that yes, she's both Confucian and a Muslim, and for her, it wasn't such a kind of contradictory a thing. That's one thing. But last May, I went to Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia for an Islam Confucian civilizational dialogue. Last one took place, well, actually many years ago with Du Weiming. So I was part of that now. And so you have what's interesting in Malaysia, you probably know this majority Muslim culture, but you have a strong minority, 35% or so of ethnic Chinese who are committed somewhat to Confucian values. And you have some who are both. You have some ethnically Chinese who are also Muslim, not many, but some, including some who are at this civilizational dialogue. So I presented a paper. First of all, what's the right way to engage between two different traditions, right? Well, one is the old missionary way, you just go and you try to convert the others. Of course, today we reject that. Another is we just try to find what's in common, and then we keep them separate, and we don't really want to learn from each other. But then I was suggesting that a stronger or more kind of long-lasting and deeper form of engagement involves mutual learning as well and mutual respect, so that both traditions can mutually improve. And I suggested putting two thinkers in dialogue with each other, both of whom are political realists in their own tradition. So one, you mentioned Xunzi from the Warring States period in China, and the other was Ibn Haldun in the 14th century, Northern Africa. And they're both political realists, and they both face the same problem. How can we extend love and care and solidarity beyond the family? And they came up with different solutions. So for Xunzi, the real key, one is through reading great works and through having great teachers, but most important of all is participating in rituals that generate a sense of community and bonding among participants. So he gives examples like drinking rituals in villages, or caring for dead bodies, which is a way also of learning about altruism. And he says it's through participating in rituals, and especially if they're accompanied by beautiful music, that the participants develop, even if they were initially kind of strangers to each other, not related family-wise, but they develop a sense of bonding and community among each other. That's really why Xunzi emphasized rituals very much. But is that really sufficient? I'm not sure. That's why I say, well, let's look at what this Ibn Haldun had to say. For him, the real key to have kind of solidarity within the tribe, what he called asabiya, is to have a strong fighting spirit, strong collective spirit. And actually, tribes with a stronger asabiya, a sense of solidarity, they usually succeed in warfare against the city-based people who are more atomistic, individualistic, lazy, soft, bourgeois types, we would say today. So he said there's this cycle in history where this tribes with this stronger sense of solidarity, they defeat the kind of decadent city types, but eventually they become soft and lazy as well, and then they're taken over by another group of nomads with stronger solidarity. So it's very interesting. So I said, well, maybe we do need, and this is where what I said was a little bit controversial. We do need to emphasize rituals, but we also need to have this kind of something to like fight against, but not necessarily let me be explicit, not in a violent way. So if we have this stronger sense of solidarity and community among ourselves, but we need a contrast. What is the contrast? It may be decadent, individualistic societies is kind of other that we need to struggle against. And for that, I was suggesting we could learn from Ibn Khaldun. Yeah.
That's very interesting interactions. I mean, between two very important thoughts or values in the world. And I think that actually taught another thing that I'm thinking about is about modernization. Like nowadays, like in the past 80 years after World War II, actually there are a handful of countries which have transitioned from poverty to modern prosperity. Some of the countries are in East Asia, such as South Korea, Singapore, and China, Southeastern Asia. They are all deeply influenced by Confucian culture. And I think you also noted in our February interview that Confucianism has experienced a revival over the past several decades. Do you think this revival essentially stems from the economic successes of these East Asian countries? How do you view the role of Confucianism in modernization and development?
Yeah, so I think so it's let's just put it this way. In the past, let's most famously Max Weber, he argued that Confucianism was not conducive to modernization. But that has been more or less disproved because you have societies with a Confucian heritage. You mentioned in East Asia, not just China, but Japan and Korea and now Vietnam, all are modernizing quite quickly in a relatively peaceful and harmonious way. And so it seems that some interpretations of Confucianism, for example, a this worldly outlook, a desire for constant self-improvement and to work hard, a concern for future generations, all these values and strong value based upon education, all these values actually contribute to modernization if the other conditions are in place. So now there's been this pride in the Confucian tradition as being not just compatible with, but actually quite conducive to modernization. That helps to explain the revival, where previously, throughout much of the 20th century, Confucianism was viewed as a kind of source of backwardness and feudalism and patriarchy. But now, actually, it turns out that it's viewed much more positively as a way that allows for peaceful and relatively harmonious and rapid modernization and poverty reduction. That's one way in which the revival is explained. But modernization also makes people more individualistic and less community-oriented, with a decrease in social responsibilities. So this too also helps to explain the revival of Confucianism, because people say, well, we modernize, we make money, but we become more individualistic and more selfish. Now what? Well, the Confucian tradition has an answer to that. Strongly emphasizes family relations and social responsibility, and that the good life lies in nourishing these humane and harmonious social relations. So I think that's another reason that Confucianism is being revived, that it responds to a kind of moral crisis that people feel. We feel that, for example, in China, many of us are too individualistic, but we don't think that's a good thing. And Confucianism is an ethical kind of resource that allows us to think about how to deal with that.
Yeah, I think that was also, I feel like it was included in the conception of Chinese modernization, which emphasized that maybe common prosperity for all, it's a modernization for all people. So yeah, I also see that from the definition here. And you mentioned that nowadays asserting the superiority of one type of value or viewpoint is becoming increasingly risky. And contemporary intellectual and inter-civilization dialogues emphasize mutual respect. can you tell us what will be your expectations for this year's Nishan Forum? And what we can expect your speech, because you are going to give a speech there. What's your expectations? What's your expectations about Nishan Forum, and what we can expect from you?
So the Nishan Forum is a large-scale gathering of people or scholars who have this interest in Confucianism, and it's international. So you have some from all over the world. I haven't seen the schedule yet, but I suspect or predict that they will involve some intercultural dialogues between Confucians and Muslims, or Confucians and Christians, and so on. I can't say for sure, but that's one function of these international gatherings. My own role, well, I'm giving one of the speeches at the closing ceremony, and well, so it will be draw on Xunzi, and it specifically addresses this problem of how we can extend love and care beyond the family, because that's always been one of the critiques of the Confucian tradition, is that it's too oriented to the family, and that people are hostile or indifferent at minimum to strangers. So it's a very strong challenge to the Confucian tradition how we can extend this love and care beyond the family. Now, it won't be the same, right? You never expected to love your neighbor's mother as much as your own mother, but part of the love of the mother should be extended to the neighbor's mother. How do you do that? Again, I think Xunzi has this wonderful idea that it's through participating in rituals that we could extend this love and care. And it's really odd, if you look at his work, he spends the greatest amount of time discussing the need to provide extended care for dead bodies of family members. And why does he do that? I mean, it's so detailed, and it seems a little bit on the face of it. But then he says, it's through this constant care for dead bodies that you learn to be altruistic towards people who can reciprocate. Because if you're caring for the dead, it's pure one-sided love, right? They can't reciprocate in any way unless you believe in ghosts or whatever. But Xunzi is the most like this worldly, anti-metaphysical of the early Confucians. It doesn't talk about that. It's pure altruism when you're caring for the dead. And eventually, if you practice that ritual in a very detailed way for a long time, then you could extend this love to the world of the living. It's a very beautiful idea. And so I'll discuss that in my closing speech.
Well, I hope the love of living can be also extended through this Nishan Forum. I'm also looking forward to your speech at that moment. And now let's move to our recommendation session. I ask every guest to share something to our listeners they enjoyed recently. It could be a book, a movie, a podcast, a TV series, or even a video game. What do you want to recommend to our listeners today?
So in many ways, I'm a boring academic. I do read a lot, but I'm going to suggest something that's maybe a little bit unusual for your listeners. So I'm from Montreal in Canada, and ever since I was a kid, I have this very strong love of ice hockey, and I've paid great attention to it again the past 2 or 3 years, especially this team, the Montreal Canadiens, which has historically been the best team in ice hockey. Now, why? I mean, of course, part of it is just pure sense of joy. It's so exciting to watch them. They're a young, very exciting team, but it's heavily ritualized. I think it's the most Confucian, or at least one of the most Confucian of the sports, without calling it Confucian, because it's very team-oriented. To do well, you have to be a wonderful team player, but it also allows for individuals to flourish within this team-oriented context. And when you interview the players after the events, they're never selfish. They always assert how first and foremost they care about the team. And even the kind of fighting in the game, it's heavily ritualized. You drop the gloves and you throw a few punches. Nobody gets really hurt, and then the referees intervene. And then after the games, at least in the playoffs, both teams shake hands and embrace each other publicly. It's very beautiful. So in a way, it's a highly ritualized game, but that also combines beauty and joy. And I would recommend, for those who are interested in the Confucian tradition, to pay more attention to this sport of ice hockey, which is growing, by the way. When I was in Beijing, I used to play a lot as well. It's expensive to play. Unfortunately, it's like in China because there aren't too many outdoor rinks. But in Dongbei, you don't have to have a lot of money to play ice hockey. I think for those who are interested in the Confucian tradition, I would recommend paying more attention to this highly ritualized and beautiful game of ice hockey. And I confess, the past few years, I spent, at least during the hockey season, at least like half an hour a day watching replays of games. Yeah.
I think that's wonderful recommendations, and I think in Beijing, at least in Beijing, there are many parents who let their children to play ice hockey. And what you just described, the way you describe ice hockey, also inspired me a lot, because I think maybe some people, when they saw the players wear helmets, they are, sometimes you also saw some video clips of people players fighting in that. That give you some impression that it was a very, hard, hardcore sports. But what you described, the way that people, when they finish the game, how they communicate with each other, that really show another aspect that may be being overlooked by some people, but really impressed me a lot. Thank you so much. And I also want to ask you about your next book, if I'm not wrong, that you have a book which is going to be published in June next year. I think it's something about like the traditional Chinese political philosophy, why it matters, right? Have you already finished this book? Can you tell us more about that book?
Yeah, so it's titled Why Ancient Chinese Political Thought Matters, and the subtitle is 4 Dialogues on China's Past, Present, and Future. And basically, what I try to do is I look at the debates between different schools before China was unified. And so you have debates between Confucians, legalists, Moists, and Taoists over issues that are still highly relevant today. For example, we discussed already in this podcast, family law, how to reduce corruption in government, to what extent the government should promote music and culture, what is morality in warfare. These were heated issues in those days, still highly topical today. So what I do in this book, I take the ancient thinkers, use their own words, and put them in dialogue with each other about contemporary issues. And the point of that is, one is to show the richness, diversity, and beauty of ancient Chinese political thinking. And 2 is to show that they're still highly relevant today. So in that book, I don't really take sides with the Confucians, even though, of course, I'm more sympathetic to them. But I try to present, whether it's legalists, Moists, Taoists, and Confucians, their arguments in the strongest possible terms, make it entertaining and accessible for the reader, and showing that it's still relevant today. So the aim is basically to show the beauty and diversity of ancient Chinese political thinking.
Thank you, Professor Bell. And thank you so much for coming to my show. And I think it's a wonderful talk today. I wish you great success in the Nishan Forum. Looking forward to your speech, and looking forward to talk with you in the future. Thank you for listening to the Inside the China Room podcast. For cooperation, investing, or feedback, you can email me directly at jjiang.sisu@hotmail.com. Alternatively, please consider leaving a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Substack. If you find our podcast helpful, we would be delighted if you recommend it to others. See you next time, and take care.